The old piano sat in the corner of the orphanage common room, covered in a thin layer of dust that nobody seemed to notice anymore. Its keys were yellowed with age, and a few of them stuck when you pressed them down. But to the boy sitting cross-legged on the floor nearby, it was the most beautiful thing in the building. Daniel was 11 years old, though he looked younger because he was so small and thin. He'd been at St. Helena's orphanage for 6 months now, ever since his grandmother passed away. She'd been the only family he had left, and when she was gone, there was nobody else to take him in. The other kids at the orphanage weren't mean to him exactly, but they weren't friends either. He was just there like a piece of furniture that everyone walked past without really seeing. But Daniel had the piano. He'd never had a single music lesson in his life. His grandmother had been too poor for that kind of thing, and the orphanage certainly didn't offer them. Still, something happened when he sat at that bench and put his fingers on those keys. It was like the music was already inside him, just waiting to come out. He didn't know the names of the notes or how to read sheet music. He just played what he felt, and somehow it always sounded right. Every afternoon when the other kids were running around or watching television, Daniel would slip over to the piano. He played quietly so nobody would tell him to stop. The music helped him feel less alone. It was like having a conversation with someone who actually understood him, even though he never said a word out loud. That Tuesday afternoon started like any other. Daniel was tapping his fingers against his knee, hearing melodies in his head that he wanted to try on the piano later. Then Mrs. Patterson, the orphanage director, came rushing into the room with that extra bright smile she wore when important visitors arrived. Behind her walked a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine. She was probably in her early 60s, wearing a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than everything in the orphanage combined. Her silver hair was styled perfectly, and she carried a designer handbag on her arm. But it was her expression that struck Daniel most. Her face looked like she'd just smelled something unpleasant and was trying very hard to be polite about it. "This is Mrs. Catherine Whitmore," Mrs. Patterson announced, her voice singing with forced cheerfulness. "She's considering adoption and wanted to meet some of our wonderful children." The woman, Catherine, looked around the room with sharp, judging eyes. Her gaze swept over the worn furniture, the peeling paint on the walls, and the children playing on the floor. Daniel could tell she wasn't impressed by any of it. She examined each child like someone shopping for fruit at the market, looking for bruises and imperfections. Mrs. Patterson guided her around, desperately pointing out each child's best qualities. "This is Tommy, he's excellent at mathematics. And this is Lucy, she's very artistic." But Catherine's expression never softened. She had opinions about everything, spoken just loud enough for everyone to hear. Too loud, too messy. Not what she was looking for. When they reached the common room where Daniel sat, Catherine's eyes landed on the dusty piano. For just a moment, something flickered across her face. Pain, maybe, or an old memory. But then her expression hardened again into that look of cold judgment. "Does anyone actually play this old thing?" she asked, her tone suggesting she doubted anyone here could play anything properly. Mrs. Patterson's face lit up. "Oh yes, Daniel here, he plays sometimes. He's quite talented, actually, though he's never had formal lessons." Catherine turned her gaze to Daniel and he felt himself shrinking under it. She looked at him like he was something small and worthless. His clothes were too big and worn. His hair needed cutting. He was nobody special, just another forgotten kid. Then Catherine said something that made Daniel's stomach drop. Her voice was full of mockery, each word designed to hurt. "If you can play that piano, maybe I'll adopt you." She smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who enjoyed watching others fail. The room went completely quiet. The other children stopped what they were doing. Mrs. Patterson looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything. Catherine clearly expected Daniel to either refuse or embarrass himself trying. She probably thought he'd bang out some simple tune like a kindergartner, proving she was right to look down on all of them. Daniel felt his heart pounding. He knew what she was doing. This wasn't a real offer. It was a test designed for him to fail, so she could feel superior. Part of him wanted to stay right where he was, to refuse to perform like a trained animal for this cruel woman. But then he thought about the music inside him, the melodies that had kept him company through the loneliest nights. That music wasn't for her. It was his, and it was real, and maybe it was time for someone to actually hear it. Slowly, Daniel stood up. His legs felt shaky, but he walked toward the piano with his head up. He pulled out the bench and sat down. His small hands hovered over the keys for just a moment. Then he began to play, and everything changed. The first notes that came from the piano were soft, almost hesitant. But then Daniel's fingers found their rhythm and something magical started to happen. This wasn't a song anyone had ever heard before. It wasn't something from a music book or a famous composer. This was coming straight from Daniel's heart, and everyone in the room could feel it. The melody was sad and beautiful at the same time. It started low and quiet, like someone whispering a secret they'd kept hidden for years. Then it grew, building into something bigger, more powerful. Daniel's small fingers moved across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible for someone who'd never had a lesson. He wasn't thinking about technique or trying to impress anyone. He was just letting the music pour out of him the way it always did when nobody was watching. Catherine stood frozen in place. She'd expected the boy to stumble through some simple nursery rhyme. Maybe Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star or Mary Had a Little Lamb. She'd been ready to give him a condescending pat on the head and move on with her tour. Instead, she was hearing something that made her chest feel tight and her eyes start to burn with tears she didn't want to shed. The music reminded her of autumn evenings years ago. Her late husband, Richard, had been a pianist, a real one, who'd played in concert halls. He'd had a beautiful grand piano in their home, and some nights he'd play for her while she read by the fireplace. Those had been the happiest years of her life. When Richard died 3 years ago, Catherine had sold that piano the very next week. She couldn't stand to look at it, couldn't bear the silence where his music used to be. She'd tried to fill the emptiness with shopping trips and charity galas and keeping herself too busy to think. She'd built walls around her heart so high that nothing could touch her anymore. But now this skinny little boy with his second-hand clothes and his dusty piano was reaching right through those walls and touching something she'd thought was dead. Around the room, the other children had stopped playing. They gathered closer, drawn by the music like it was pulling them in. Some of them had tears on their cheeks. Mrs. Patterson held her hand over her heart, her eyes wide. Even the staff members who'd been working in other rooms came to the doorway to listen. Daniel kept playing, lost in his own world. The melody spoke of loneliness and missing someone who was gone. It talked about cold nights in empty rooms and trying to be brave when you felt small and forgotten. But there was something else in it too, something that felt like hope struggling to survive. It was the sound of a child who'd lost everything but refused to let go of the one thing that made him feel alive. When the music finally faded away, Daniel lifted his hands from the keys. The last note hung in the air for a long moment before disappearing. Then there was just silence. Complete, absolute silence. Daniel kept his eyes down, staring at his hands. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He'd done something he'd never done before. He'd played his music for other people. Really played it, not just the quiet background melodies he usually made when he thought nobody was paying attention. He'd shown them something true about himself, and now he felt naked and vulnerable. He waited for Catherine to laugh or say something mean. He waited for her to tell him it was terrible, that he'd wasted her time. That's what adults usually did when you hoped for something. They disappointed you, but Catherine didn't say anything. When Daniel finally got the courage to look up at her, he saw something shocking. The cold, hard woman who'd walked into the orphanage was gone. In her place stood someone who looked lost and broken. Her perfectly made-up face had tears running down it, smearing her mascara. Her hand shook as she reached into her expensive purse for a tissue. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Catherine's voice came out rough and unsteady. Nothing like the sharp, mocking tone from before. Daniel shrugged, still not quite believing what he was seeing. "I didn't learn anywhere. I just play what I feel. My grandmother used to say that music doesn't need fancy lessons. It just needs truth." Catherine pressed the tissue to her eyes, trying to compose herself. She was aware that everyone was staring at her, watching her fall apart in front of a room full of orphans and staff. The old Catherine would have been mortified, but right now, she couldn't seem to care about keeping up appearances. "My husband," she said quietly, speaking more to herself than to anyone else. "He used to say the same thing. He said that all the technique in the world meant nothing if you couldn't make people feel something." She looked at Daniel properly for the first time, really looked at him, not just at his worn clothes and messy hair. She saw a child who'd suffered loss just like she had. A child who'd taken that pain and turned it into something beautiful instead of building walls around it the way she had. Catherine opened her purse again, this time pulling out her phone with trembling hands. She scrolled through her contacts until she found her lawyer's number. Mrs. Patterson watched with growing hope and disbelief as Catherine made the call. "Gerald, it's Catherine Whitmore. I need you to start adoption paperwork immediately." Her voice was stronger now, more certain. "Yes, I'm serious. I'll explain everything later, but I need this done as quickly as possible." She hung up and looked at Daniel, who was staring at her with wide, confused eyes. The other children were whispering excitedly. Mrs. Patterson looked like she might faint from shock. "I made you an offer," Catherine said to Daniel, her voice still thick with emotion. "And unlike me, you kept your end of the bargain. You showed me something real." But as Daniel would soon discover, Catherine's decision to adopt him wasn't quite the happy ending it seemed to be. She was taking him home, yes, but the reasons behind it were complicated and messy. Just like everything else about grief and loss and trying to fill the holes that people leave behind when they're gone. 3 weeks later, Daniel stood in the entrance hall of Catherine's mansion, feeling smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. The ceiling was so high his neck hurt from looking up at it. There was a crystal chandelier hanging above him that probably cost more than the entire orphanage building. Everything was white and cream and gold, so clean and perfect it didn't look like anyone actually lived there. Catherine's driver had picked him up that morning with his single duffel bag of belongings. The whole car ride, Daniel had tried to convince himself this was real, that he finally had a home. But standing here now, surrounded by all this expensive emptiness, he wondered if he'd traded one kind of loneliness for another. "Your room is upstairs, second door on the left," Catherine said, her voice back to that crisp, businesslike tone. The crying woman from the orphanage had disappeared. This Catherine wore her armor again, her face carefully composed, her emotions locked away. "Helen will show you around. She's the housekeeper. Dinner is at 7 sharp. Don't be late." Then she walked away, her heels clicking on the marble floor, leaving Daniel standing there with a woman in a gray uniform who looked at him with pity in her eyes. The first few days were strange and quiet. Daniel's new bedroom was 3 times the size of the room he'd shared with 5 other boys at the orphanage. It had its own bathroom with a bathtub so big he could practically swim in it. The bed was soft, the sheets were new, and there was a closet full of expensive clothes that Catherine had bought without ever asking what he liked. But the house felt like a museum. Catherine had rules for everything. Don't touch the vases. Don't run in the hallways. Keep your voice down. Sit up straight at dinner. Use the right fork. Daniel felt like he was constantly one mistake away from breaking something priceless or doing something wrong. And Catherine barely spoke to him. She'd given him this beautiful room and all these nice things, but she never asked how he was doing or if he was happy. She was like a stranger who happened to live in the same house. At breakfast, she read her newspaper. At dinner, she checked her phone. The only time she really looked at him was when she was correcting something he'd done wrong. 2 weeks after he moved in, Catherine made an announcement at dinner. "I've hired a piano teacher for you. His name is Mr. Brennan, and he's one of the best in the city. Your lessons start Monday, 3 times a week, 2 hours each session." Daniel's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "A piano teacher? Of course. You have raw talent, but you need proper training. You need to learn technique, music theory, how to read sheet music. You'll be learning classical pieces, the real masters. Beethoven, Mozart, Chopin." She said it like this was the most obvious thing in the world, like she was doing him a favor he should be grateful for. "But I don't want to learn classical music," Daniel said quietly. "I like playing my own songs." Catherine's expression hardened. "Your own songs? Daniel, that's just improvisation. It's not real music. Real music requires discipline and structure. If you're going to live in this house, you're going to learn to play properly." Daniel wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that his music was real, that it meant something, but the way she looked at him made the words die in his throat. So he just nodded and finished his dinner in silence. Mr. Brennan arrived that Monday with a briefcase full of sheet music and a personality that matched Catherine's perfectly. He was strict and precise, correcting every finger placement, every posture mistake. He taught Daniel scales and exercises that felt mechanical and boring. He made him play the same measures over and over until they were technically perfect. No, your wrist is too high. Again from the beginning. And don't put so much emotion into it. This is Bach, not a melodrama. Precision first, feeling later. Daniel practiced every day because Catherine expected it. He learned to read music, to understand time signatures and key changes. His technique improved rapidly. Mr. Brennan called him a natural, said with proper training he could play in concerts one day. Catherine seemed pleased with his progress, or at least she stopped frowning as much during his practice sessions. But something was dying inside Daniel. The music that used to flow out of him naturally now felt trapped behind rules and expectations. He was learning to play what other people had written, following instructions on a page, making his fingers do what they were supposed to do. It was all correct and proper and completely empty. Late at night, after Catherine had gone to bed, Daniel would sit by his bedroom window and tap his fingers silently against the glass. The melodies were still in his head, still trying to get out, but he'd stopped playing them. The piano downstairs had become a tool for lessons, not a friend for conversation. 3 months passed like this. Daniel became more skilled and more miserable. He played Chopin perfectly and felt nothing. He mastered difficult Mozart pieces and wanted to cry. Catherine scheduled him to perform at her upcoming charity gala, showing him off to her wealthy friends like a prize she'd won. One afternoon, Daniel was in the music room practicing when he overheard Catherine talking to a friend on the phone in the next room. Her voice carried through the open door. Yes, the adoption is working out well. He's becoming quite accomplished. Richard would have been proud. It's like having a piece of him back, you know? The house feels less empty with music in it again. Daniel's hands froze on the keys. Suddenly everything made sense. Catherine hadn't adopted him because she wanted a son. She'd adopted him because she wanted to replace what she'd lost. He was just a living reminder of her dead husband, a way to hear music in her house again without dealing with the pain of her memories. He wasn't Daniel to her. He was just a substitute for someone else. That night at dinner, Catherine complimented his progress on the Beethoven sonata. Daniel just nodded and pushed his food around his plate. The expensive meal tasted like dust in his mouth. He had a home now. A beautiful room, nice clothes, and a prestigious piano teacher. He had everything except the one thing that actually mattered. He had everything except someone who actually saw him. The night of Catherine's charity gala arrived with all the pressure and expectation Daniel had been dreading for weeks. The mansion was transformed into something even more grand than usual. Waiters in black suits carried trays of champagne and fancy appetizers. Women in evening gowns and men in tuxedos filled every room, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Catherine had bought Daniel an expensive black suit that felt stiff and uncomfortable. She'd had his hair professionally cut and styled. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. He looked like a little adult, like a doll she'd dressed up for display. "Remember everything Mr. Brennan taught you," Catherine said, adjusting his tie for the 3rd time. "Play exactly as you practiced. No improvising, no mistakes. These people are important, Daniel. Don't embarrass me. Don't embarrass me. Not do your best or I'm proud of you. Just don't embarrass her." Daniel nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The grand piano stood in the center of the ballroom, polished until it gleamed under the chandelier lights. It was the same piano that had belonged to Catherine's late husband, the one she'd bought back specifically for Daniel's lessons. It was beautiful and perfect and completely terrifying. At 8 o'clock, Catherine stood and clinked her glass to get everyone's attention. The crowd quieted down, turning toward her with polite, curious faces. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Catherine began, her voice smooth and confident. "As many of you know, I recently adopted a young man who has shown remarkable musical talent. Daniel was living in an orphanage, but I saw something special in him. Tonight he'll be performing several classical pieces to demonstrate what dedication and proper training can achieve." The way she said it made Daniel's stomach turn. She made it sound like she'd rescued him, like he'd been nothing before she came along. She talked about him like he was a project, a before and after transformation she was showing off. Not once did she mention the music he'd played that first day, the music that had actually moved her. The guests applauded politely as Daniel walked to the piano. He sat down on the bench, his hands cold despite the warmth of the room. He could feel 200 pairs of eyes watching him, judging him, waiting to see if he was worth their attention. He began with the Chopin piece Catherine had selected. His fingers moved through the notes exactly as Mr. Brennan had taught him. Every trill was precise, every dynamic change perfectly executed. It was technically flawless. The audience seemed impressed, nodding appreciatively. Then came the Mozart, then the Beethoven. Each piece was performed perfectly, without a single mistake. Daniel had become exactly what Catherine wanted, a well-trained performer who could execute difficult music without error. Mr. Brennan would have been proud, but Daniel felt nothing. He was playing someone else's music, following someone else's rules, being someone else's version of what he should be. The notes came out right, but they were empty. This wasn't music. It was just noise arranged in a pretty pattern. When the final Beethoven piece ended, the guests applauded. Some of them applauded enthusiastically, impressed by the technical skill. Others clapped politely, the way you do when something is nice but not particularly memorable. Catherine stood near the front, smiling her public smile, the one she wore at these events. Daniel's hands rested on the keys. The applause started to fade. He should stand up now, bow, walk away. Catherine expected him to. Everyone expected him to. But something inside Daniel cracked. Maybe it was seeing Catherine's satisfied smile, knowing she'd gotten exactly what she wanted from him. Maybe it was feeling like a trained monkey performing tricks. Maybe it was remembering the boy he used to be at the orphanage, the one who played music because it was the only honest thing in his life. His hands were still on the keys, and before he could talk himself out of it, before he could be the good, obedient boy Catherine had molded him into, Daniel started playing again. But this time, it wasn't Chopin, or Mozart, or Beethoven. It was his music. The melody that had been trapped inside him for 3 months finally broke free. It poured out of him like water from a broken dam, raw and real and absolutely nothing like the polished classical pieces he'd just performed. The guests looked confused. Some of them glanced at each other, uncertain. This wasn't on the program. This wasn't what they'd expected. Catherine's face went pale, then red. Daniel could see her in his peripheral vision, her hand gripping her champagne glass so hard he thought it might shatter. But Daniel kept playing. He played all the loneliness he'd felt in the big empty mansion. He played the sadness of losing himself piece by piece. He played the anger of being treated like a project instead of a person. He played the desperate hope that somewhere underneath all the rules and expectations, the real him still existed. The melody evolved, grew, became something bigger than it had been at the orphanage. 3 months of classical training had given him new skills, and now he was using them not to play what others had written, but to express what he actually felt. It was structured and wild at the same time, technically impressive and emotionally devastating. Some of the guests looked genuinely moved. A few had tears in their eyes. Others still looked confused, uncomfortable with this departure from the safe classical performance they'd expected. But Daniel wasn't playing for them. He wasn't even playing for Catherine anymore. He was playing for himself, for the boy who'd gotten lost somewhere between the orphanage and the mansion. When the last note finally faded, Daniel lifted his hands from the keys. The room was completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. He stood up slowly, his legs shaking, and for the first time in 3 months, he felt like himself again. Then, without looking at Catherine, without bowing or acknowledging the stunned guests, Daniel walked out of the ballroom. He walked through the entrance hall with its high ceiling and expensive chandelier. He pushed open the front door and stepped outside into the cool night air. Behind him, he could hear the murmur of confused voices starting up again. He could hear Catherine making excuses, trying to smooth things over with her guests. But he didn't care anymore. Daniel kept walking until he reached the garden at the side of the house where there was a fountain and some stone benches hidden by trees. He sat down, his fancy suit already getting wrinkled, and finally let himself breathe. Daniel sat on the stone bench in the garden, watching the moonlight dance across the fountain water. His heart was still racing from what he'd just done. Part of him felt terrified about what would happen next, but another part of him felt lighter than he had in months, like he'd finally set something free that had been suffocating inside him. He heard footsteps on the gravel path and knew without looking that it was Catherine. He'd expected her to come, expected her to be furious. He waited for the lecture about embarrassing her in front of her important friends, about being ungrateful after everything she'd done for him. But when Catherine reached the bench, she didn't yell. She didn't lecture. She just stood there for a long moment, her expensive dress rustling softly in the night breeze. Then slowly she sat down beside him. The silence stretched between them, Inside the house, Daniel could hear the muffled sounds of the party continuing, guests laughing and talking like nothing unusual had happened. Out here, it was just the two of them and the sound of water trickling from the fountain. "I sent everyone home," Catherine finally said, her voice quiet and tired. "Told them you weren't feeling well, that the pressure got to you." They believed it. They always believe whatever I tell them. Daniel didn't say anything. He kept his eyes on the fountain. "That song you played," Catherine continued, "the one at the end. It was the same one from the orphanage, wasn't it? Except different, deeper somehow." "I've had 3 months to think about it," Daniel said softly. Catherine was quiet again. When she spoke next, her voice cracked in a way Daniel had never heard before. "I've been a terrible mother to you, haven't I?" Daniel looked at her then. In the moonlight, without her perfect makeup and practiced smile, Catherine looked older and more fragile than he'd ever seen her. She looked human. "You've been a good provider," Daniel said carefully. "The room, the clothes, the lessons, all of that is more than I ever had before. But that's not what you needed." Catherine pressed her hands together in her lap. "I adopted you for all the wrong reasons, Daniel. I know you heard me on the phone that day. I saw your face at dinner afterward." Daniel felt his throat tighten. He'd thought she hadn't noticed. "When my husband died," Catherine said, staring at the fountain like it held answers she'd been looking for, "I couldn't handle it. Richard was my whole world, and then one day he was just gone. This house became so quiet I thought I'd go crazy. I sold his piano because I couldn't stand hearing silence where his music used to be." She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing what was left of her mascara. "Then I walked into that orphanage and heard you play, and for the first time in 3 years I felt something other than emptiness. But I didn't adopt you because I wanted a son. I adopted you because I wanted to fill the silence. I wanted to hear music in this house again. I wanted to pretend that if I could just train you properly, I could somehow bring back a piece of what I'd lost." "I know," Daniel whispered. "I tried to turn you into him," Catherine said, her voice breaking completely now. "I tried to make you play his music, follow his path. I took away the thing that made you special because I was too scared to let you be yourself. Because your music, the real music you play, it reminds me that he's gone. It reminds me that life goes on even when you wish it wouldn't. And I wasn't ready to face that." Tears were running down Catherine's face now, and she didn't try to hide them. "You were so brave that day at the orphanage. You showed me something true about yourself, something honest. And what did I do? I took that honesty and tried to crush it into something I could control." Daniel felt his own tears starting. "I thought if I just did everything right, if I played what you wanted and learned what you wanted, maybe you'd actually love me. But you were always looking past me, seeing someone else." "I'm so sorry," Catherine sobbed. "I'm so sorry. You deserved a mother who saw you, who loved you for who you are, not for what you reminded her of. You deserved so much better than what I gave you." They sat there crying together, all the hurt and disappointment of the past 3 months finally breaking open between them. The garden was quiet except for their tears and the fountain and the distant sounds of the city beyond the walls. Finally, when the tears slowed down, Daniel said, "That song I played tonight, do you want to know what it was about?" Catherine nodded, wiping her face with her hands. "It was about being lost," Daniel said. "About feeling like you're in a beautiful place, but you can't find yourself anymore. But it was also about hoping that maybe you could find your way back, not to who you used to be, but to who you're supposed to become." Catherine looked at him, really looked at him maybe for the first time since the adoption. "You're 11 years old and you're wiser than I'll ever be. My grandmother used to say that pain either makes you smaller or bigger. It's up to you which one you choose." She sounds like she was a remarkable woman. "She was," Daniel said. "I wish you could have met her." Catherine reached over hesitantly, and this time when she pulled Daniel close, it wasn't the stiff, awkward hug of someone going through the motions. It was real, messy and imperfect and real. "I want to try again," Catherine whispered into his hair. "I want to be better. I want to know the real you, not the version I tried to create. Will you give me another chance? Will you teach me how to be the mother you deserve?" Daniel thought about it. He could say no. He could ask to go back to the orphanage, start over with someone else. But he thought about Catherine's tears, about the crack in her armor that had finally let the truth through. He thought about how sometimes the people who hurt you aren't monsters. Sometimes they're just broken people trying desperately not to fall apart. Only if you promise something, Daniel said. Anything. Promise that you'll let me play my own music. Promise that you'll stop trying to make me into someone I'm not. Catherine pulled back to look him in the eye. I promise. And Daniel? Will you teach me about your music? About how you create it? I want to understand. Over the weeks and months that followed, something changed between them. Catherine canceled the lessons with Mr. Brennan. Instead, she asked Daniel to play for her his own compositions, and she listened. Really listened. She asked him questions about what inspired different melodies, what he was feeling when he played certain passages. And Daniel, slowly, started sharing more than just his music. He told her about his grandmother, about the orphanage, about his fears and hopes. Catherine told him about Richard, about their life together, about her grief and her mistakes. The house became less like a museum and more like a home. Catherine still had her charity events, but now when Daniel played at them, he played his own music. Some of the guests didn't understand it, but some did, and Catherine was always the proudest person in the room, not because he was performing perfectly, but because he was being authentically himself. A year later, at another gala, Daniel premiered a new composition. This one wasn't about loneliness or loss. It was about finding connection in unexpected places, about two broken people learning to heal together, about how family isn't always about blood or perfect moments. Sometimes it's about being brave enough to be honest and caring enough to change. When he finished playing, Catherine had tears in her eyes again. But these were different tears. These were the kind you cry when something painful becomes something beautiful. I'm proud of you, she said afterward, hugging him tight. And this time, Daniel knew she wasn't proud of his technique or his performance. She was proud of him, of the person he was, of the journey they'd taken together. I love you, Mom, Daniel said. It was the first time he'd called her that. Catherine held him tighter. I love you too, son. The real you. Always. And in that moment, both of them understood that adoption wasn't about filling empty spaces with substitutes. It was about two imperfect people choosing to see each other, accept each other, and grow together. It was about turning pain into purpose and silence into music that finally felt like home.